So we've talked about basic text formatting, and I'm going to try this little magnification thing. So right here, any tool that has this little arrow underneath it tells you that there's more tools, and then it sort of pops out. You can kind of see it. It sort of pops out to the side. So we have the type tool, area type tool, type on a path, vertical type, vertical area type tool, vertical type on a path tool, and then the touch type. For the most part, I tend to use the type tool, the area type tool, and the type on a path. I will show you vertical type. It basically works the same as our regular type tool, but for the purposes, of our lecture, I will show you. So it works pretty much just like the regular type tool, and I'll switch back to it. So if we copy, all I did was I selected all of this and I copied it. And I'm going to go back to our type tool and paste the same thing. You'll see basically all it does is it flips the type on a vertical path rather than, or a vertical baseline, I should say, than a horizontal one, right? It works exactly the same. Visually, it might be a little bit different, obviously, because we have, kerning and tracking works slightly different because you would technically be kerning and or tracking from like baseline to the top of the letter instead of middle spacing, but it works the same. You have your, let's select all of this, and again you can set your tracking really wide or really tight. Vertical type has a tendency to naturally be kind of loose. I feel like it sort of depends on the font too, but you'll see I'll undo, even before we adjusted any tracking, technically these letters, let's go back to 72 just so it's nice and even. So all of this is defaulted. The kerning is set to auto, tracking is 0, our horizontal and vertical scaling is exactly the same. And you can see they present very differently, right? So when you're using vertical type, a lot of times you have to adjust differently, kind of like when we were talking about kerning, kerning different fonts, like different fonts, even if you have a basic sans serif font, 2 different basic sans serif fonts are going to sort of kern and track differently. So it's a similar kind of thing, but vertical type can come in super handy, obviously, if you want to type something vertically, right? So I figured I would show you that, and again, like I said, we can kern and track, and then you'll see our icons change slightly. So we have the kerning knows that it's vertical. So let's just make that. I'm going to scroll. You can also, if you have your mouse over, let me do this again. If you have your mouse over your tools that you're using, if you have it slightly over the window and you scroll, you can also sort of fine tune instead of just typing. Sometimes I find that a little easier than typing rather than scrolling rather than trying to type everything in. Sometimes it works a little bit better. The bad thing is I have to pay attention because I have a tendency to, as I'm scrolling or picking something or whatever, I have a tendency to accidentally scroll and then you change something. So if you are using that scrolling feature, you just have to be mindful that you're not accidentally changing something. So I won't kern all these, but you see you can still kern. Obviously, it's going to be very, very different kerning vertically than horizontally. But you can see all your tools work exactly the same way. Selecting text, you have your cursor over the text, and selecting letters is exactly the same. If you kind of double click inside the selection, it selects all of your text on the line. Again, everything else is the same. Your font sizes, your leading. Your leading is going to work very differently because, again, vertical versus horizontal. So it's going to be the spacing in between returns. So I have 2 returns here. So your leading is going to work, again, horizontally rather than vertically. A lot of times, for me anyway, 9 times out of 10, if I'm using vertical text, it's usually only for like a word. Like I'm generally never really like typing anything for copy for reading vertically, just because we don't really read that way. So usually it's just kind of like a thing for a logo or one quick element. So generally I don't tend to worry about leading in between lines, because obviously our second line goes to the left, which is kind of interesting. You would think naturally it would go to the right, but it goes to the left. But anyway, so that is vertical tracking, or vertical type rather. The touch type tool I will go over relatively quickly. What it allows you to do, so all of these, this whole statement, whatever you want to call it, all of these characters are in one text block, right? So it's all on one baseline, and there's a return, obviously here, and they've done some adjustments to each letter as we cycle through. Oops, cancel. As we cycle through, you can see, or not, it's giving me warnings that it's formatted in a different version of Illustrator. Anyway, what they did right now is it's all the same font and the same size. It's just upper and lowercase letters. What the touch type tool allows you to do, and it's this last one here, what the touch type allows you to do is it allows you to manipulate characters within a line, within a baseline, a set of characters, and it allows you to manipulate each character individually, but also keeping it part of that same group of characters, if that makes sense. So right now, this is all one group, right? And if we wanted to, let's say, oops, we're on a touch type tool. Let's say we wanted to turn this T a little bit. So we go up to this little handle at the top, and you can see our arrow changes a little bit, and we can turn that. We can also move it up or down. We can kind of turn it this way. And you can see the one kind of tricky thing about using the touch type tool. Let's say we want to make this one a little bit bigger. Oops, move it down. I want to make it a little bit bigger. I'm holding shift so that it doesn't, I keep my proportions the same. Anyway, so you see as I'm going through, I can manipulate each individual character. Oops, sort of as I want to, kind of arbitrarily here. But you can see kind of the sort of tricky thing about it is once I start manipulating and turning, like the C, for example, you can see how all the other letters are shifting around it. They're generally shifting around that bounding box that we talked about early in the semester. It doesn't necessarily, now here it sort of is like the U, and I think it's just because I moved the U over, but the U is coming in really close. But you can see it gets kind of tricky. So once you start moving this, you know, all I'm doing is rotating. Once you start rotating, manipulating each individual letter, you kind of have to rekern, oops, just about every time. So you get the general idea. I'm not going to do every single letter, but it keeps, oops, and if we go back to our select tool, it keeps everything as part of that same line of text, right? So it's still an editable line of text that we can still, I double click just to go back to our, you know, let's say we wanted to change that to a U for whatever, you know what I mean? So we can still type and edit without having these be on individual lines. In the past, if you wanted to do something funkier like this, each character would have to be an individual line. You had to do it like, if we wanted to do this, we would have had to do T, and then I'm doing my option, copy, and then make this one an O, and then option and copy, and this one a U, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but you get the idea. So each one of these is an individual piece of type, right? So if we wanted to edit, you know, touch, for example, you would have to go into each individual letter. This is where, like, to be honest, you know, I find doing this just as useful as doing this. I mean, this is like, I guess this is sort of a quick handy way to sort of manipulate text, and oops, helps if I go to the right tool. It's a relatively quick handy way to manipulate text if you want to have, you know, some of these rotated in. Oops, I wanted to select the P. And the E will rotate this way. You know, it's a relatively handy tool if you want to quickly manipulate individual letters on a single line of text. And you can change colors. Oops. Again, helps if I go to the right tool. You can change colors. Where are my swatches? Bring up my swatches here. You can change individual colors if you want to. So if you were to, this is where it could potentially come in handy. If you were to just select with our regular type tool, or even our selection tool, if you were to select that whole group, obviously, and change the color, it changes all the color. You could do a couple different things to change the color. You could select each letter individually that you want to recolor. This is where, after you've used the touch type tool, it gets a little bit tricky to select letters. That's technically the U. Right? So you can see kind of selecting gets a little bit tricky, or you can use the touch type. It's a little bit easier once you've manipulated the letters to select each individual letter and change the colors. May or may not be handy to you guys. I personally don't really ever use it. But it's in the chapter, and I figured I should at least show it to you. There's some tools you'll find that once you sort of get your own workflow and what works for you, you'll find some tools work handier than others. There's a couple other ones that come out through the semester, like a shape builder tool, that personally I don't find it incredibly useful. I have a friend that finds it super, super useful, so that's why I show you all this stuff. So getting into fitting type into an object, or flowing type into an object, right? What we can do, so we have this, oops, and I'm on my touch type tool. I don't want to do that. I'll go back to my regular type tool. Here we go. So there's, of course, multiple ways you can do the same thing within Illustrator. What we can do is, one of the things is you want to get this text, and let's say for the assignment that we're working with, we're going to actually have this more in a diamond shape. So I'm going to take this square, I'm just going to go to the outside edge here to where my cursor, oops, there we go, gets sort of bent a little bit, which allows me to rotate. And I'm just going to hold shift so it locks it 30 degrees, I think. 45, whatever that is. Yeah, 45. So that we're going to have this text flow into this diamond shape, right? So I'm going to select, all I do is I double clicked with my regular text tool, and I'm going to do select all, which is Command A or edit. Where is it? or select, there you go, select all, and then I'm going to copy, Command C, or copy. And then there's a couple different things you can do here. When you're on an object, you can go to your, first we can go to our area type tool, and you'll see how our cursor has sort of switched. There's that little, I can't really point, but there's that little sort of round object around the cursor instead of a baseline. Oops. So that allows us to area type, and I wanted this to come up. So now I just clicked in an empty space. So it's telling us you must click on a non-compound, non-masking path to create inside a path. So basically it's telling us there's no path here for me to paste into. You need to do that. So when you're on your almost said touch type. When you're on your area type tool, it automatically will default to only working inside an area. So if you go here, now you can see if you click on that edge, then you get that dummy text in there, the lorem ipsum dummy text. And then I'm going to paste, because I have our copy here copied, and you can see it fits it into that space. And it's pretty much as simple as that. You're basically just copying and pasting text into objects. And then you can format it from there. Let me undo very quickly. I personally, I kind of always forget about the area type tool because, so we still have our text copied, right? So you'll see our regular type tool has just the square around it and a baseline. And if you hover over anything that it will interact with, you see that automatically switches. See if that gets a little bit closer. You see how that automatically goes from like the square to the circle? So it's sort of automatically recognizing that area type. So if we click on the edge of an object and then paste, we can still technically do the same thing. So I have a tendency to forget to switch tools. There's a couple little, the main difference between using the type tool and using the touch type tool by itself is the touch type tool won't recognize when you're not in an area to be able to type in. So if you don't want to accidentally, like I do all the time, will accidentally click outside and go create a text, create a baseline by accident outside of that. So that's the one handy thing to using that area type tool, is that you can't accidentally click and create type elsewhere. So like I said, you can format your text fairly just like anything else. I say fairly because it depends on the shape of the object. So here I'm going to center this, and then you'll see here this little gimmick right here basically shows us that we have text overflow, and what that's telling us is that we have too much text for the area, right? So it's not showing. So there's a couple different things that you can do. Is you can you can either make your object larger, or you can make your text smaller. In this case, we're going to make the text a little bit smaller. Bring in that tracking, or that leading rather. We could even bring in the tracking slightly. Let's go to there we go. So we're just adjusting the tracking a little bit just so everything fits within that shape. And you can see it kind of has that diamond shape. Depending on the shapes that you're using, and this is with any program, obviously you're kind of limited with text as far as like how closely it follows the shape. You can do a couple different things where if you format your paragraph, if you do the full justification, so what that does is the full justification versus aligning it. You can see how this is a little bit more widely spread than a line that has a lot of text on it. It's a little bit closer, what it does is it adjusts everything on the line to go from the beginning to the end of the full baseline. So hence full justification. So you can do full justification if you want. What ends up happening is here where we have one word and a decent amount of space, this crayon got spaced out a lot. But it also follows the shape of the diamond-ish shape that we have here. A little bit better rather than just center justified. You can see we get this kind of kick out here and here where it sort of messes with the shape a little bit. So those are a couple things that you can do to make flowing into an object a little bit easier. And again, it doesn't really matter what shape. For argument's sake, I'll grab an ellipse here. I'll move this over. Make this slightly bigger. Go to our type tool and go to the edge here. And you can see pasting into a circle is pretty much the same thing, and then we can mess around with the justification a little bit to give it that more circular look. You'll also notice that once we turn an object into a text object, once we turn it into a type area, that any formatting goes away. So if you're used to frames in InDesign, that's where frames handle very differently in InDesign, is they will allow you to sort of keep the color. You can change the color of the text and the frame, where Illustrator does not. So if you were to change any color here, it's going to automatically affect the fill of the text rather than the fill of the object. If you want to select, there we go, with your direct selection tool, you can select the edge of our circle here. And let's see. Then you need to change the color. You can change the inside color from there. Or let me hit undo. Or you can put a stroke on the object if you want to keep that round stroke on the object. Oops. Helps if I actually select. We'll go back to center here. So if you have that, that stroke around your object, to keep that, if you didn't want to do the full justification, you just want to do the center justification but keep that circular look, you can direct select with your white arrow tool here, your direct selection tool, and select just the edge, and you can see that little dot pops up to show you. Oops, I'm trying to get rid of my magnification. Come on, there we go. And then you can change the stroke or the fill from there. Let's see. So going into, lastly, this is where text can get a little bit tricky. I'm going to undo a bunch. When we work on typing on a path, and specifically for this assignment, we're going to be typing on a circle and putting text around a circle. So I'll keep the circle here. What you are going to need to do is, under our type tool, select type on a path, and then you'll see as we go, my mouse is sticking, you'll see as we go to the path, and you'll see it has that funky little curvy baseline. When we go to the edge of a path, unmagnify there, you'll see it fills our space here with the dummy text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm just going to use my name, and I don't know, oops, I don't know why it's defaulting to a font that isn't there. Let's just use that. And you'll see that now it's placed, oops, now it's placed our text on a path. And you get all these funky looking visuals, right? This is where working with type on a path gets a little bit tricky. So we have here, this is our beginning of the path, and then this is our end to the path, which shows that it goes pretty much all the way around the circle. And then this over here is our center line to the path, and then obviously our type that is on the path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to center so that our type falls right on the center line. And this is where my magnification thing is going to come in handy, because this can be kind of tricky to see when you're actually like working with it. It's that weird, you have this baseline here. I'm trying not to make everybody motion sick here. You have this baseline here, and then you have this center line. And what this allows you to do, when you grab that center line, you can tell that you've got it when that changes to that little center line. It allows you to move that center line, and this is where it gets kind of finicky sometimes, as you can see. There we go. And now we can move that center line to the top or wherever we want on that path. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a light stroke on that path just so you can see the path. So what that allows you to do, again, it allows you to move that center line, and you can see it's also on the bottom opposite. It's also moving the opening and closing bracket, or the beginning. And you can see as I'm moving my mouse, it gets kind of tricky as it wants to flip. If you move the mouse inward a little bit, you can move it to the inside of the path or the outside of the path, and you can see it's upside down on this part of it because you've rotated it all the way around. So you can have things, you can have your type flipped to the inside, and I'll show you some more options for formatting, or on the outside. And as it's like sort of freaking out here, you can see it gets pretty finicky. Sometimes it has, there we go. Sometimes it helps to zoom in a little bit as well, to format these a little bit easier. But generally, it's just kind of sort of getting the hang of it, because you'll see it kind of, again, once you start playing with it, you'll see how sort of finicky it can get. You have other options. What I tend to do a lot is under type and under type on a path. You have I'll show you on a different thing. You have a bunch of different options for how it presents. Then you also have type on a path options, and this is super handy when you're working specifically in circles, because we do this a lot with either circles or arced graphics, things like that. You can have it align. Oops, I want to preview it. You can have it right now. It defaults to align to the baseline, so the baseline sits on the outside of the path. You can have it align to the descender, which aligns the lowest. It's obviously not the Y. The lowest descender will touch the baseline. You can have it aligned to the baseline, the ascender, or what I do a lot is have it aligned center, because I find that a lot easier to deal with, especially when you're rotating text. You can also flip it. So I'm going to hit cancel here. So let's say we still want it to the baseline, right? And we've moved our text down to here, but we don't want it to be upside down at the bottom. We want it to be right side up. We go to our type on a path options. I'm going to preview it. And if we flip it, oh, it should have, I was hoping it would go the other way. And then here, you can have it aligned to the ascender. Again, baseline is going to have it aligned to the inside. You can either have it aligned to the ascender or have it aligned center, which I tend to do. I tend to have it aligned to center more often than not because it's easier to deal with that way. And you can see now when you flip it, see, it's super finicky even for me. I'm trying to flip it the other way. I'll just go back. So now if we don't want it to be upside down, I find that especially with circles, again, I know I've said this a bunch of times already. There we go. Especially with circular paths, having it aligned to center is sort of my default because it's just sort of easier to deal with when you're arranging it. When you're arranging your text around an object, I just find it easier to have it aligned to the center of the object. This also works for pretty much any kind of shape. I don't necessarily see it around, around a rectangle for obvious reasons. I'm just going to do the preview text. I'm not going to, but you'll see how it kind of goes around a square. It sort of breaks up oddly around a square. That's not to say you won't ever use that, but you can have it go around any object, and also you can have it, I'm just going to draw a funkier shape here. I'm going to swap that so it's just a stroke. So you can also have your type, I'm going to select all and copy this text. Move that over. You can also have type follow an open path. Open paths versus closed paths we'll get into, but this is any shape is a closed path. Basically means like the circle is closed, where an open path has two open ends. So you can have it flow on an open or a closed path. So I'm just going to go back to my area type tool, and I'm going to type on that path. And you can see the text flows along that path. I'm gonna put a stroke on this again so we can see it a little bit. So you see here we get that text overflow again, which I was expecting because we have a ton of text on a small path. But you can also see that once we're back on our type on a path, that once we're back on our type, that our type path starts a little bit in, and you can adjust that. Go back to so you can adjust that by grabbing that handle and just dragging it all the way to the beginning, and then you have this handle aligned all the way to the end of our path there. So this is where our text open and text closed handles can come in handy. Obviously, this is a ton of text on this path, but you can see how the text flows fairly well on a curved path. I'm gonna select all, and we'll knock this down a little bit. I don't think we're gonna get all of it to fit, but as you can see, we have to get super small for it to actually fit. But you get the general idea. You can still format text the same way, obviously, on a path. Either in a frame, or not a frame, rather, in an object, on a path, on a closed path here, or on an open path here. And you can also do the same things as you can. You can flip your text. We don't have as much space to play with because the text is here. Let's do this. I'm going to cut that and then paste. So now we have just a little bit of text. So you can move your text along that path as well, just by moving. I move that handle in a little bit to the end of my line, so it gives us a little bit of room to play with. So you can have, if you wanted this type to be at the end, give or take. You can pop that baseline to the end or to the beginning or somewhere in the middle-ish of your path. Again, you can even flip it. So you have the same options no matter what type tool you're using, whether it's straight up type on a path, or an area type. You can still format the same way. And then the area and the type on a path tool work in similar ways to be able to move them around and also fit them to a variety of different objects and shapes.